The lonely farmer saved the Apache chief's son. The next day, the chief arrived with 20 beautiful brides and said, "Choose." Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Wind moved across the flats long before the sun dropped, carrying dust and the cold bite of evening. Eli Mercer had been in the north pasture most of the afternoon, checking the fence line where two posts leaned from last month's windstorm. He didn't rush the work. He never rushed anything. The hammer hung from his belt, and the coil of wire scratched against his coat every time he bent to lift a rail. The fields around him were thin and yellowed, the soil hard as packed bone from years of going half-worked. He didn't mind. He didn't plant for yield anymore. He planted because hands working soil kept his thoughts dull and quiet. His cabin sat a quarter-mile south, a low structure of dark pine set against a scatter of bare trees and a stretch of rocky rise. One window, one door, one lantern that never threw light far. Behind the barn, on a slight hill dusted with old snow, were two narrow graves with no markers. He never walked there unless he had to bury something else. In 5 years, he hadn't spoken a word over that patch of ground, not even to the earth. The temperature dropped early that day, sky going pale and thin as sleet clouds drew in from the west. The animals felt it too. The two horses stamped near the corral, snorting as if the air bit their nostrils. The mule near the fence chewed at a shred of hay caught in the wire. Chickens had already gone quiet in their lean-to box by the barn wall. Eli wiped his hands on his coat and watched the last of the sun sink down behind the far ridge, a slow fade of light swallowed by cold. He moved toward the cabin with the same steady walk he used every day, boots leaving flat prints in frozen dirt, shoulders set, eyes scanning the fields out of habit, not fear. The axe leaned by the chopping block just outside the door, where he'd left it that morning after splitting what was left of the pine stack. The split would lay in uneven piles beside a rusted washtub, frost clinging to the edges. He stepped up onto the small porch, pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned once and went still. Inside, the room held the same weight it always did. One cot against the far wall, the stove in the center with a kettle blackened from years of use, a table with one chair, both worn smooth by hands and time. Hooks near the door held his coat from a war and a spare shirt that hadn't been mended since last winter. Everything in the place had a place, but none of it looked tended with care, only kept from falling apart. He knelt by the stove and opened the iron door. Ash shifted and pooled near his boots. He stacked kindling with the same deliberate movements he'd used 10,000 times. Small sticks first, then a split log. He struck the match and listened to the dry catch of flame against wood, the crackle settling low like a whispering animal. He didn't speak to it. He never did. When the fire took, he hung his coat on the chair back and rolled his sleeves. He filled the kettle from the bucket near the door and set it atop the ring. Steam would come when it wanted. He didn't wait on it with any patience or hurry. He moved to check the latch on the window, the one that rattled when wind rose too hard. He pressed it once and felt the chill ease by a fraction. Light faded out of the window completely now, leaving only the flicker of the stove and the shadowed corners of the cabin. Eli stood by the table and rubbed a thumb along a groove cut into the wood years ago by accident, maybe by anger. He didn't remember anymore. The silence pressed in a way it did every evening, not loud, not empty, just there. The kind that didn't answer when spoken to, which suited him fine because he'd run out of things worth saying. Outside, something thumped against the barn door, a loose board or a shifting animal. He didn't react fast or slow, only turned his head and listened until the noise stopped. Coyotes sometimes came near the chicken run, but he'd wired the bottom tight last month after losing 2 hens. He didn't go to the window to look. If something was out there worth knowing, he'd know when it reached the door. The kettle hissed faintly, and he poured a tin cup half full. He drank standing up, near the stove, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. His hair hung near his collar, darker where sweat had dried. His beard was trimmed only by habit, not vanity. His hands, still rough from fence work, rested flat on the rim of the stove for warmth. 5 winters alone, and he'd grown used to the rhythm. Work, fire, sleep, wake, work again. Nights like this one were all alike. No voices, no footsteps, but his own. No reason to expect change. That was the only way his life stayed bearable. Nothing new, nothing to stir what he'd buried. By the time he finished his drink, night had settled in full and the wind quieted to a low push against the boards. He checked the stove once more, then sat on the edge of the cot without unrolling the bedroll. He didn't lie down yet. He sat and listened to the wood pop inside the iron, staring at the floorboards where dust gathered in the seams that he did not know that before the next sundown, something would break the pattern he'd kept like armor. But that night, the land held its silence, and he matched it the way he always had. The night settled deeper before anything changed. Eli stayed on the edge of the cot longer than usual, not because sleep wouldn't come, but because the silence around him felt heavier than the wood in the walls. He didn't think about why. He rarely wondered at his own pauses. When the stove dropped to a dull red, he finally stretched out on the bedroll, laid across the cot, and pulled the blanket over his chest. His boots stayed on. He always slept with them that way in cold months, so he wouldn't waste time if something stirred outside. Sometime past midnight, the wind picked up again, this time carrying a whistle through the crack in the window frame. He opened his eyes once, then shut them again. No reason to rise. The kettle had stopped steaming. The fire dimmed to a low orange. The animals outside had gone quiet. The land, same as him, seemed to have nothing left to say that it was near dawn when the sound came. Faint and thin, not like hoofbeats or coyotes. More like something soft dragged across frozen ground. Eli's eyes opened and stayed open. He didn't sit up at once. He listened. The sound stuttered, then stopped. Then came again, closer this time. Not footsteps, not an animal he knew. A scraping, uneven rhythm. He swung his legs over the cot and stood, joints stiff from the cold that crept under the door. He crossed the window and pushed the shutter just enough to see a sliver of gray morning. The horizon was pale and flat, sky still holding the last of the night. The yard showed nothing at first glance, just the corral fence, the barn's slanted roof, the line of willows at the edge of the pasture. The sound didn't repeat. He watched a moment longer, then let the shutter fall back into place. That he pulled on his coat and took the rifle from the wall, checking the chamber by habit, though he hadn't fired it in weeks. He didn't rush the door. He opened it slow, listening for breath or movement outside. The cold hit his face like wet stone. Frost crusted the steps. His breath made short clouds in the At first, he saw only the prints of his own boots from the evening before. Then, farther out past the barn, near the slope that led to the north pasture, he saw something dark against the frozen earth. Not a shape he recognized right away. Not an animal. Not a stump or tool left behind. He stepped off the porch and walked toward it with that same even pace he used for everything. Rifle lowered, but ready. As he got closer, the shape became clearer. A body, face down, clothing ragged and dark with dry blood. Not white, not Mexican. Apache, young, shoulders broad, like someone not yet grown into their frame. The boy's hair lay matted against the ground, black and tangled with frost. An arrow shaft jutted from his side, the feathers broken, the wound crusted dark. Eli knelt beside the body and pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck. The skin was cold, but under it a faint pulse still worked, slow and weak. Breath came in thin shudders, barely visible in the air. The boy's face was turned partly into the dirt, lips cracked and pale. Whoever left him there hadn't come back. Eli didn't look around for tracks or signs of who'd done it. He saw enough: drag marks in the hard ground, dry blood in a trail that stopped near the fence line. No horse nearby, no gear, just the boy and the cold coming on. That he slid his arms under the youth and lifted him over his shoulder. The weight wasn't much, less than a sack of grain, but the dead limp hang of the body made it awkward. Eli stood and adjusted his grip, the rifle still slung across his back. He didn't speak to the boy, didn't grunt, didn't curse. He started toward the cabin in that same slow, controlled walk, boots crunching frost with every step. Inside, he laid the boy on the cot and dragged the chair closer to the stove. He stoked the fire back to life, fed it with 2 split logs and kindling. The heat rose quick in the cramped room. He stripped the torn shirt from the boy with a knife to keep from moving him too much. The arrow was lodged deep under the ribs. Old blood had frozen into the fabric. Eli heated a knife tip in the stove and carved around the shaft just enough to free it without tearing the lung beneath. The boy flinched once, but didn't wake, that he cleaned the wound with boiled water and strips of calico left from his wife's sewing box. The box hadn't been opened in years, but he knew where it was without thinking. He packed the wound with pine pitch and bound it with the cloth in firm layers. He worked quiet, hands steady and practiced. He had done this same thing in the war to men who didn't speak his language any better than this boy could. When it was done, he covered the boy with the blanket from his own cot and laid his rolled coat near the boy's feet for weight and warmth. The fire cracked louder, thawing the air enough that steam peeled off the kettle again. Eli didn't ask himself why